The birth of the Steve Parks guitar, that's what this video is all about. But before anything can be born, it has to be conceived first, of course. So I think we better start by going right back to the very beginning to see how this exceptionally long gestational period got started in the first place. I dabbled with an acoustic guitar from the age of about 14 or so, but it had always been a bit of a background hobby, and I'd only ever been able to strum chords to accompany my own singing, nothing more than that. By the time I was in my 30s, I was working in the art studio of Clarity Print, a printing company in the West Midlands. My immediate work colleagues, here we all are, were all pretty much into the pop music of the day, which we used to listen to at work by playing tape cassettes of our favourite bands. Our sales rep, Gary, was also an accomplished guitarist in a band in his spare time, and one day in 1983 he brought his Gibson SG copy in to show us, one he'd had custom built to his own spec by a local luthier in Birmingham. It looked a bit like this one, finished in white I remember, and he plugged it into his amp and played us the entire lead solo from Hotel California by the Eagles. I was well impressed. This was the first time I'd ever known anybody who'd had a guitar custom built for them. It was an entirely new idea to me back then. At that same time, Gary had talked enthusiastically about his admiration for Brian May, the guitarist from Queen, and mentioned that he had built his own guitar, with his dad's help, to his own entirely original design. Now, when it comes to design, as in designing something myself that's entirely new, that has always been my passion in life. Graphic art had become my lifelong career, so this idea of someone like him actually designing and building his own unique guitar really fired my imagination and appealed to that part of me that loved designing things. Straight after that, I saw a copy of Guitar Heroes magazine in the newsagents with a picture of Brian May on the cover with his red special guitar, so I bought myself a copy. This very copy, in fact, and I devoured the article inside. There were so many unique features that Brian May had built into that guitar, I felt utterly inspired. The neck had 24 frets. That's 2 complete octaves, something I'd never heard of before at that time, when all electric guitars, as far as I knew, only had a standard 21 frets, or 22 at the most. He'd also given his fretboard a 0 fret, just inside the nut at the top. This was, he said, to ensure that all chords, whether bar chords or containing open strings, would sound consistent, which makes perfect sense to me. His unique tremolo and roller bridge were designed to minimise friction there, which could otherwise throw the tuning out after using the tremolo arm, while his headstock was shaped to keep the strings running as straight as possible up past the nut, again to reduce friction and help to avoid it going out of tune. Back in 1983, these were all radically new ideas to me, but they made such a lot of sense. I felt so inspired after reading that article that I decided I wanted to design my own unique guitar, and was even toying with the idea of trying to build it myself for a brief mad moment. And because I loved the sound Brian May got out of those Burns Trisonic pickups, I put those on my wanted list as well. Unfortunately for me, Burns guitars had ceased production at that time, so acquiring a set of those pickups would have been something of a problem. However, I didn't let that dampen my creative enthusiasm. Now, although I was inspired by Brian May's Red Special, I wasn't a particular fan of the way it looked. Yes, it was very different, but it wasn't different enough, and it wasn't me. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for in a guitar outline, but I wasn't impressed with any of the currently available body shapes. I liked the idea of a cutaway body, especially a symmetrical double cutaway body, enabling the player to reach the higher frets much more easily. But I didn't like the way those cutaways often left two big prominent upswept horns. I supposed that the horns were to try and keep the body weight more balanced for the player, but I just didn't like the look of them at all. On the other hand, I'd always liked Paul McCartney's iconic Hofner violin body bass for the way it seemed to be completely cut away where it joined the neck, giving freer access to the higher frets, and yet that almost traditional violin shape just seemed too lame and not different enough. I wanted a bold, innovative shape that hopefully no one had ever seen before. Nothing outlandish or gimmicky. I wanted something subtle and classy. Just what, I had no idea at that point. I was going to have to get doodling and scribbling and see what I could come up with. My ideal shape would have double cutaways, but no upswept horns, which, the more I thought about it, seemed to present a whole raft of unexpected difficulties, proportion-wise. The first design I came up with ended up looking like this, which was bland and uninspiring, to say the very least. The overall size was too small, and the shape of the upper bout was piddling and insignificant. Small shoulders is what it reminds me of. No, this was not good enough. Next came shape number 2. I'd enlarged the lower bout and slightly squared off the shoulders of the upper bout, but it still looked lame and not dramatic enough. It wasn't what I wanted at all. Number 3, which came next, was getting a bit more like it. I'd widened the lower bout a little bit and given the shoulders a more dramatic shape, bringing them out wider and making them more prominent. I tried adding a scratch plate design to this one. I thought it looked marginally better, but it still wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I still wasn't 100% happy with it. I can remember lying in bed, looking up at the tops of the closed curtains in front of the window, where they were gathered into folds, and sometimes seeing something like the shape I was seeking there. But it was maddeningly elusive. They say that sometimes you can draw inspiration from the most unlikely of places. After this number 3, I've no idea what happened to number 4. I seem to have no record of it now. My old drawings jumped from number 3 straight to number 5. As soon as I'd drawn this one up, number 5, I knew straight away that this was the one. I'd widened the lower bout still more, slightly dropped the position of the waist, and given more of a sensual curve to the shoulders. This body shape ticked all my inner boxes and actually made me smile to look at it. I just knew this was the perfect shape that I've been dreaming of. Now, you might not see what all the fuss is about with this shape. I suppose it's not all that remarkable, if I'm totally honest, yet somehow it rang hooters, whistles and celebratory church bells in my head. I can't really explain what it was, and still is, about this shape that made me so joyful to look at it. I just knew that this was my baby. This was my perfect guitar body shape. I'd arrived at my ultimate design. So how about a scratch plate, I thought. All the best electric guitars up to that time always had a scratch plate, which generally complemented and enhanced the shape of the body. This one demanded more subtlety. I felt it instinctively. I no longer wanted to put a curly tail on it like the Fender Strat or the Burns Marvin. No. This one needed to be much more understated than that. I did a few tentative sketches on tracing paper and very quickly came up with this shape, which I called the pie, as it vaguely reminded me of the side view of a very deep-filled pie. I got it. Here was my perfect guitar shape, from a purely artistic and visually aesthetic point of view, of course. Now that I'd got my ideal design more or less sorted out, my thoughts naturally turned to the very big question of how, if ever, could it actually become a reality. I'd come to realise that there was no way I could have attempted to build a guitar like this myself. I knew I'd have to pay a specialist guitar maker to build it for me, but at the time I'm talking about, 1983, I was not a rich man. My work at Clarity Print paid the bills and kept us reasonably fed, but there was never any spare money for anything like this, so I had grave doubts I was ever going to be able to afford to take this project any further, at least for the foreseeable future. So, reluctantly, I just filed all my drawings away and forgot about it for the next few years. Well, actually, for the next few decades. In fact, almost 40 years have gone by since then, and an awful lot has happened since that time, as you can imagine. The children grew up and we all moved away from the Midlands and came down to the West Country, where the children all went their separate ways and most started families of their own, as they do. My wife Anne and I reached retirement age, and then sadly I became a widower in 2015. Out of all my children, Dylan was the main one who took up playing the guitar, becoming way more competent a player than I ever was. It was Dylan who suggested I dug out my old guitar designs again, and seriously looked into the feasibility of finally getting it made up by a professional luthier. This time I thought, yes, let's do just that while I'm still here to see it happen. I looked online to find any luthiers that might be around in this part of the country, focusing particularly around Bristol as being the likeliest location, I thought, to find a good one. I was fairly quickly drawn to one who seemed to stand out to me, Waghorn Guitars, run by the man himself, Tom Waghorn. The work he'd produced looked to be really top quality, and his reviews from satisfied customers were absolutely glowing, to say the least. It was quite obvious to me that I wasn't going to find anyone else who could surpass his standards, so I decided Tom Waghorn was the man I should contact when I made my inquiries. Before I emailed him, though, I realised that one of the key components of my guitar design was the set of 3 Burns trisonic pickups, as used by Brian May on his Red Special, which back in the 80s had been almost impossible to obtain. So I needed to do a bit of research into how feasible or not it was going to be to try and find a set of those. A quick online search, however, came up trumps, much to my astonishment. There was a new unused set from Brian May Guitars, original and in their box, offered for sale on eBay for what I considered to be a reasonable price, so I snapped them up. Trying to get hold of a set of those had been my main worry. All the other bits of hardware were pretty well standard and easy to lay hands on. That brought me to the tremolo bridge unit. On my original design, I'd always imagined I'd be using a Fender Stratocaster tremolo bridge. To be honest, it was the only one I was reasonably familiar with the appearance of, and I'd drawn one onto my design by default, not having any reason to want any other style at all. It looked the part and had always served Hank Marvin and every other famous Stratocaster player well enough, so that's the one I'd always planned for. However, it must have been fate, because just at this very time that I was sorting all the bits and pieces out ready to put together a possible order, a video jumped out at me on YouTube, singing the praises of a superb-looking tremolo, the Sapphire 2.22, made in America specifically to replace and improve on the standard Fender Stratocaster tremolo. There was this guitar aficionado named Darryl Braun saying, "You need to try this trem," and I have to say that as I watched the video through, he convinced me that using one of those superbly made Sapphire tremolo units would give me a much better quality and far more reliable tremolo bridge than I'd have had if I'd just opted for a standard Fender Strat model. The timing of this couldn't have been better, and I emailed the company to find out more on the same day that I bought the Burns pickups. I was now ready to take the plunge, and I filled in the detailed inquiry form on the Waghorn Guitars webpage, including an image of my design and saying I would be providing the Burns pickups, but asking if they could get the Sapphire tremolo, perhaps with a trade discount. Tom Tom Waghorn replied very promptly, saying he would find out about the sapphire tremolo and get back to me with his quote as soon as possible. Meanwhile, while I was waiting, I began to design my own headstock shape for the guitar, something I'd never got round to doing up until then. I wanted it to work like Brian May's design, inasmuch as the strings should travel up from the nut to the tuning pegs in as straight a line, lengthways, as possible to reduce friction when using the tremolo. Tom had a stock selection of shapes on his website, and I was particularly drawn to the Kronos S, which looked very much to me as though it was the right configuration I was after. However, I wasn't at all keen on the sharply angled tip of it, and I wanted to change that into something that looked a bit friendlier. I decided I'd round it off like this, giving it a nice semicircular tip. To finish it off, I added my own signature to the top of the headstock to give my name to the guitar design. The neck and headstock were to be a nice light maple, with the fingerboard in black ebony by contrast, which would be a similar colour balance to this Stratocaster here, which was just how I'd pictured it. A few days later, the Burns pickups arrived safely in the post, and then a couple of days after that, Tom emailed me his official quote for building my guitar, which I found to be quite reasonable, and roughly what I'd been expecting for such a quality custom-built instrument. I went over to Bristol to see him at his workshop very soon after that, to place my firm order and to pay him my deposit. There were half-built guitars all over the place, and I found it all absolutely fascinating. I left the pickups with him as well as my life-size tracing for the body and headstock shapes, and we also talked about small but important details like the subtle radius on the fretboard, something I hadn't even thought about before. I've always played flat-profile fretted guitars and ukuleles before now, so I decided on the very subtle curve of a 16-inch radius after Tom showed me a sample of one. For the volume and tone knobs, I settled on a black witch's hat style, similar to Brian May's silver ones, only black. I felt they'd contrast nicely against the white body of my guitar. This is a more realistic artist's impression of how I hoped the guitar was going to look, which I coupled together after I got back home from visiting Tom, using bits of photographs of the various components. At this stage in the proceedings, I'd fully intended to have 6 small toggle switches, exactly the same arrangement that Brian May's Red Special has. That's a pair for each of the 3 pickups, made up of an on-off switch and an out-of-phase switch for each one. So I'd modified my 37-year-old design to follow Brian May's layout, like this. However, after lengthy discussions with both Tom and Dylan, I decided this was not the best way to arrange the controls, as it was full of potential problems on a practical level. Tom finally came up with a winning suggestion. He sent me a photo of this guitar, which was one of his own builds as it happens, and suggested we could adopt the same control system as this one. It had a big 5-way selector switch, just like the Fender Stratocaster, which allowed you to turn on the usual 5 different combinations of the 3 single-coil pickups on the fly, as shown on this Strat diagram here. Yet at the same time, it had 2 out-of-phase switches for the neck and bridge pickups, which are normally wired in phase with each other, while the 3rd switch brings the neck pickup on independently of the main selector switch. This would give you all the same options that Brian May's 6 mini toggle switches would, but with possibly less confusion. That seemed to me to be the perfect solution. 2 black knobs for volume and tone control, a Fender-style selector switch, and just 3 mini toggle switches instead of 6. Much better. Not only that, but if you remember, my original design from the 80s actually did feature a Fender-style 5-way selector switch, around which I'd vaguely drawn an improvised cover plate, so in a way I was staying true to my original concept in that respect. As you can see, I'd now modified my new artist's impression to show the new controls in their new positions. I put the selector switch in a very similar place to where I'd originally drawn it, running straight up and down, keeping parallel to the strings. I placed the 2 black knobs next to it, like eyes to its mouth in a kind of sideways face. Then, after some careful thought, I eventually positioned the 3 mini toggles as you see here. 2 of them dead in line with the slot in the selector switch, while the third one sat at right angles to the top one and at an equal distance from it. This not only looked good in my opinion, but it made sense in as much as 2 of them were out of phase switches, but the third was to turn the neck pickup on independently, so this right angled positioning emphasised the differences in their functions. This arrangement also provided an ideal place to put the jack plug socket on the edge of the guitar, smack in between the 2 outer toggles like this. Tom's huge workload meant that it was going to be at least 18 months before the guitar was likely to be completed, so meanwhile I had plenty of time to start thinking about where that metal cover was going to come from for that 5-way selector switch. The more research I did online, the more I came to realise that a switch cover like that one simply didn't exist at that time. Every guitar on the market that used one of these selector switches only ever had it fitted in one of 3 possible ways. Number 1, on an actual Fender Stratocaster, it was always screwed to the underside of the extensive plastic scratch plate with the slot cut through it like this. Number 2, on a Fender Telecaster, it was always fixed to the back of the long metal control panel, like this, along with the 2 knobs for volume and tone, while the panel itself was held in place by its own separate screws. Number 3, on any other guitar, it seems to be screwed to the lacquered surface of the guitar front, sometimes flush with the surface or sometimes slightly recessed. I could find no instances of one being fitted with a small protective plate around just the switch, like I'd shown on my design, yet I definitely wanted one, as I could so easily imagine how the white lacquered finish around an unprotected switch would very quickly start to wear away after a while and start looking very shabby, and I did not want that to happen to my guitar. I'd always envisaged a cover, so a cover was what it was going to have. I discussed it with Tom, and he'd never come across a selector switch cover like this before, though he said he'd be quite happy to make me one. At that point, I had a bit of a brainwave. Looking at the metal control panel on a Fender Telecaster, I realised that the slot and screw holes were ready-made in one of those, so all we'd have to do would be to get one and then cut it down to the right shape and size for my customised switch cover. If we could also find one made of solid stainless steel too, that would be ideal, as the cut and shaped edges would all be the same colour and we wouldn't have to think about chrome plating afterwards. Tom agreed that would be a good idea, though he did say that his only previous experience with stainless steel had shown it to be hellishly difficult to cut with a hacksaw. At this point, knowing it was still going to be a few months away before Tom would be able to make a start on my order anyway, I decided I might even have a go at making the cover myself in the meantime. So I looked online, on eBay, and sure enough I found a seller who had some stainless steel Telecaster control covers, who happened to be located in Greece. His price was very good, so I bought one from him, and after a very short time it arrived safely to my door. I told Tom I was going to have a go myself at cutting it down to make the switch cover. If I messed up, we still had plenty of time to get a replacement and try again, so he wished me the best of luck and asked me to let him know how I got on with it. The first thing I had to do was measure it up and mark it out with the outline of the cut-down cover I wanted. I found I had to use a fine point marker pen, as pencil wouldn't show up on the stainless surface. Once I'd done that, I made a start on cutting it along the guidelines, though I straight away found out what Tom had meant by a hacksaw barely being able to scratch the surface. Luckily though, I had a rotary engraver as well as an electric drill, both able to be fitted with cutting discs, so using those I began to make some very slow headway. It took me a while, as progress was painfully slow and the metal was almost 2 millimeters thick, but working steadily and patiently, I eventually managed to cut all around the piece until I'd finally got my cover completed and separated from the rest of the old control panel. And there it is, very roughly cut out as you can see. I still had a lot of filing and smoothing to do here before the edges were perfectly formed, and all those jagged lugs and angles needed to be rounded off nicely. And when I'd finally completed all the filing, rounding and smoothing, here was the finished product. The edges were chamfered and rounded at the top, and I'd given the whole top surface a thorough going over with the finest steel wool to bring it back up to a lovely satin sheen again. I was really pleased with that. I sent Tom an email with these pictures to show him how the job had progressed, and he was as chuffed as I was, I think, that we were one step further on with the guitar. We agreed that I should hang on to this cover for now for safekeeping, bearing in mind that my guitar was still only one of many stacked up orders on his waiting list at that time. But then, just at that precise time, in March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world and we all went into lockdown. These were unprecedented times. It was the biggest crisis since the Second World War, and the whole world was touched by it. Tom was effectively prevented from getting to his workshop, which meant he had to work from home as much as he was able to. This inevitably had huge consequences when it came to his work turnover. There were certain jobs he was still able to carry on with in his garage at home, but some of the more particular jobs, like applying finishes for example, could only be done using the specialist equipment and environs of his workshop, so that led to inevitable delays with his ongoing projects. His original estimate of 18 months for my guitar, which I'd worked out should have been ready roughly around the time of my 71st birthday, was now seriously out of the window thanks to the pandemic, and it felt as though my guitar's completion was flying further and further away from me, keeping an elusive and constantly extending distance away. It couldn't be helped, of course. These were difficult times for everybody, and we all had no other choice but to just roll with it. It was going to take a few months longer before I'd be able to get it, and that was all there was to it. Eventually, though, Tom did manage to get through his workload sufficiently to enable him to finally make a start on my guitar. I'd asked him to take progress photographs along the way, which he was quite happy to do, and the first ones he sent to me around December 2020 were these. This was a real pivotal moment for me. For almost 40 years my guitar had only existed as an idea in my head and a few drawings on paper. Now, for the first time ever, some actual pieces of wood had been chosen and cut to shape, ready to form the body and the neck of the Steve Park Special. Here were two nice lengths of maple, sawn out roughly to form the neck. The headstock end was already cut to a gentle angle, with a reinforcing knuckle or volute, to give it its correct term, at the back of the angle joint. I was pleased and reassured to see that volute. To me, that was a sign of quality. At the same time, he sent me these photos of two large pieces of alder, butted up side by side, obviously intended for the body. Red alder is often used for solid electric guitar bodies because it's a medium weight wood that's fast growing and readily available. It's got a tight, consistent grain and provides a strong, clear, full-bodied tone that offers good sustain as well. Because of the overall size of the body, I wasn't surprised to see it was going to be made up of two halves which would be glued together down the centre. The neck, however, did surprise me to see that it too was going to be glued together lengthwise from two separate pieces of maple. I was slightly puzzled by that, and I asked Tom why that was. He explained that on some cheaper mass-produced guitars, the neck is often cut out of one piece, which can often warp or twist. Here's a really bad example. That's a really bad twist on that. He also explained to me the difference between plain sawn timber and quarter sawn timber, and illustrated it with a diagram very like this one. The quarter sawn log on the right means that the growth rings cross most of the boards at a much better angle, making for much more stability in the wood. Cutting this way, of course, means there's more waste, making quarter sawn wood more expensive than plain sawn, but its extra stability and its resistance to splitting and warping, added to the beauty of the visible wood grain, makes it the first choice for craftsmen everywhere, including guitar makers, of course. The two halves of my guitar neck had been cut from opposing ends of the same block of maple, as you can see here in diagram A, because Tom wanted the shallow angled headstock to be all in one with the neck. He'd carefully chosen the block so that the growth rings would run nicely from front to back after the two halves had been cut out, as you can see from diagram B and C. Their opposing grain directions meant that once they'd been firmly glued together, as in C here, they would stop each other from warping and would make for a much more solid and stable neck than a mass-produced one piece could ever be. Once the pieces were cut out like this, it was important they should be left to settle for a couple of weeks or so before gluing them together, after which they needed to be left to settle all over again. That was to ensure that any possible movement in the wood happened before the guitar was built and not after it was made. These photos were just before they were joined in December 2020. A couple of weeks or so after that, Tom sent me some more exciting pictures. This one shows the two halves of the neck and headstock lying on their sides and clamped together securely after being glued down the middle. I know you can't see it very well behind those 10 clamps, but you can just about tell what it is, and I found it very exciting to see this, another step forward. This photo here shows the two halves of the older body after they'd been glued and clamped together with sash clamps. After jointing, they were all left to settle once again before any further work was done on them. Then, when that time had safely passed, Tom planed and levelled the neck blank, then routed out the truss rod channel. Next, the pieces of maple known as the ears, for fairly obvious reasons, were glued onto the sides of the headstock to make up that extra width needed for the shape. Once those glued joints were cured safely, the ears were planed level, the truss rod was fitted into its channel, and a strip of hardwood was glued over the top to keep it secure and stop it rattling about. In this instance, Tom used an offcut of black ebony, but it could have been anything. Then the headstock facing was made out of a thin piece of maple, ready to be glued in place once the ebony fillet had been planed level. This was another exciting stage for me, seeing my special headstock shape marked out and roughly cut out for the first time. A couple of weeks later, I received the next batch of pictures from Tom. This one showed the headstock facing being glued in place, held down securely by a battery of clamps working through a dark plywood caul to even the pressure all over the area required. You can also see to the left how the truss rod fillet had now been playing flat, ready for the fretboard to go over it later on. You can see that better on this one, where the headstock facing was now glued firmly in place, ready for the next stage, which would be cutting the headstock to size and shape. Around the middle of May 2021, he sent me this photo, which just made my heart sing for want of any better description. There it was, my own special guitar body shape that I'd designed back in the 1980s, actually cut out in real life, with the heel routed out for the neck, which was also lying there next to it with its headstock properly cut to shape and already drilled for the tuning pegs. It was like a dream coming true for me. This was the very first picture I'd seen of the body shape cut out, and it felt so good to see it. Then, a couple of weeks later, 3 more pictures arrived, showing how he'd routed out the positions for the 3 pickups, as well as drilled the holes ready for the tremolo bridge posts. He sent me this one to demonstrate how tall the Burns pickups were, and to show that their seatings needed to be fairly deeply set to allow for their proper height adjustment when he later came to set them up behind the strings. This third picture included the neck, with its new addition of the ebony fingerboard, complete with its slots already cut for the fret wires to be inserted later on, including, I noted with satisfaction, the slot for the 0 fret right at the top, just below the groove where the nut would eventually be placed. This was such an exciting time for me. I found myself checking my emails more often than normal, just in case there might have been a new update from Tom. Round about this time, Tom had asked me if I could send him the stainless steel cover plate for the selector switch, as he'd routed out the electronics chamber on the back and was almost ready to start positioning all the controls and switches. So I very carefully packaged it up and posted it to him, as the COVID restrictions were still in force then, and me travelling to Bristol with it on the bus was very undesirable at that time. He got it okay, and then, as he began to work out just how he was going to put it all together, he realised we had a new problem. It was one that, surprisingly, turned out to be a real head-scratcher for a time. No wonder I'd never seen switch covers like this on any other guitars before. On a Telecaster, the switch gets bolted to the back of the cover plate. Then the plate itself has its own separate fixing screws at each end, where it can be screwed to the front of the guitar. My stainless cover only had those two holes to fix it to the switch itself, as you can see in this sketch. The steel plate at the top is screwed to the switch mechanism under it, but then they're just sitting loosely in their wooden slot in the bodywork, with no means of fixing them in place, so they're just moving freely up and down, which is not what we want. It was Tom who came up with the solution. He had the brilliant idea of using a couple of old Tune-o-matic bridge saddles, like these ones, as improvised clamps to hold it in place from the inside. He drilled out the threads of the two holes in the switch base plate, then replaced the screws with longer bolts, whose threads matched the threads in the Tune-o-matic saddles, which he then screwed up onto the bolts until they clamped it all in place like this. The only trouble with that was, it now became apparent that the switch unit itself was now loose to slide down the bolts onto the clamps. But that was easily solved with a couple of strong pickup mounting springs to keep it up at the top, like this. He sent me this amazing photo of the routed out electronics chamber on the back, with the selector switch clamped into its slot by those two repurposed Tune-o-matic saddles. When you zoom into it here, you can easily see how those little saddles make perfect clamps at each end to hold the switch firmly in place. From the front, the cover sat in place just right, and with the cover off, you could see how Tom had cut the slot just exactly right to snugly fit around the base plate of the switch. The holes were now drilled too for the knobs and toggles as well, and this photo showed the hole in the bottom edge, ready for the jack socket to be installed there later on. This view shows the guitar at that stage in its development, while it was still chunky and Telecaster-like, and before the body bevels had been properly determined. That came next. Tom and I had already talked about how I wanted a large diagonal slice taking off the lower left corner of the body, where the player's arm would rest, just like on a Stratocaster, as well as a large tummy tuck chamfer to come off the back edge along the top curvy side where it pressed against the player's body. The whole point of doing these was to make the guitar more ergonomic in shape, so that it'd sit more comfortably against the player's body, wouldn't dig into their playing arm, and be much more comfy to play. He sent me these photos of how he'd marked out in pen lines the areas he proposed to cut away, including flowing the tummy tuck chamfer around the back of the short horn and into the heel of the guitar as he'd marked it here. He also sent me this picture of one of his earlier guitars where he'd done a very similar thing. I showed these photos to Dylan, who agreed with me that this shaping would be spot on and just right, so I told Tom to go ahead and carve it like this. That was in the early part of July, and things went a bit quiet for a month and a half, from my viewpoint anyway, until I got these new photos from Tom around the end of August that showed how he'd smoothed and rounded the edges all round the body and carved the big corner chamfer for the player's arm to rest across. I assumed he'd done the tummy tuck bevels at the back as well, though you couldn't really see those from these front view shots. The stainless steel frets were now all in place, and he'd inlaid the mother-of-pearl dots on the fretboard as well, following my instructions to replicate the same pattern that Brian May had used on his Red Special. He asked me if I wanted the side dots to follow the same pattern as the front ones, and I said yes please, if at all possible. I also sent him this drawing of how I wanted the truss rod cover to look that covers the adjuster hole in the headstock. A simple and elegant shape, which Tom always made out of wood rather than plastic, so I chose maple to match the headstock itself so it'd be less conspicuous and create a more subtle effect. 3 weeks later, on 6th of October, he sent me these 4 photos, showing it all completely shaped and all ready to be sprayed with the white polyurethane finish, providing I was happy with everything. I was over the moon, to be honest, and I told him so. It was like a beautiful piece of sculpture. He'd also now inlaid the marker dots along the edge of the fretboard, as you can see here, as well as carving the back of the body for the tummy tuck shaping. It was all looking superb. I said I was extremely happy with what he'd done, and he could go ahead with the finishing coats. The next photos came 3 weeks later, after I'd raised the question with him about where best to position the top strap button. By this time he'd done what he called the base coat, so the pieces now had a nice gloss to them where the wood grain had been filled and sealed. Tom was recommending that the button should go here, as he was demonstrating in this photograph. I wasn't sure at first, as I thought the strap could pull away from the button there because of the angle it was placed at, but the only realistic alternative was to place it here, behind the neck socket, which would seriously get in the way of a player trying to access the highest frets. He suggested instead that we used strap locks like these, which would ensure that the strap couldn't pull away from the button on the shoulder here, so that's what we agreed on in the end. His other photos showed the base coat on the neck and headstock. Again, just look at that beautifully carved volute at the base of it. What a craftsman he is. Notice the green masking film here, covering and protecting the ebony fingerboard and the stainless frets from the lacquer spray. Christmas and New Year were upon us next before we knew it, and it wasn't until late January that I received the next progress photos. Tom's family had caught COVID. He'd lost 2 of his workers because of the lockdowns, and his main helper had left and got another job. So it wasn't surprising that things had slowed down a bit over that time, especially when you consider that this polyurethane lacquer finishing stage is the most labour-intensive and sensitive part of any guitar's construction, and Tom had been doing it all single-handed, as well as juggling all his other orders at the same time. Finally, however, he got the top white coat on the body. Doesn't that look simply beautiful? It does to me anyway. And look at the neck now. He'd added a warming tint to the clear polyurethane finish, and it gave the natural maple a richer, warmer colour, as you can see here. Another exciting development was that he'd at last been able to apply the 2 logos to the front of the headstock. His Waghorn logo is in its usual place up the centre, and my Steve Parks signature at the top, both applied underneath the final glossy finish. After another short wait, I got the next photos through, showing the stainless steel frets being levelled, rounded and polished. The next photo was taken a few days later and showed the back view, where not only had the neck finally been firmly bolted to the body at last, but the electronics cavity had also been lined with copper foil to act as a shield from the magnetic pickups. The Sapphire tremolo unit had also been installed loosely. This showed the front view at the same stage. You can see here how beautifully smooth and rounded the stainless frets are now. They look a treat. Then in this picture, Tom had fitted the 2 outermost strings to enable him to fit the pickups into their recesses and line up the poles correctly under the strings. In order to do that, of course, he'd had to fit the tuning machine heads and the black Graphtec nut, which you can see here. He was getting very close to completion now, and he told me that he just needed to fit the electronics and wire them all up, and after that he'd make and fit the scratch plate around the pickups. It was looking quite magnificent at this stage. Then, in seemingly no time at all, he sent me this picture, which induced a firework display of emotions in me. My guitar, my unique designed Steve Parks guitar, the impossible dream for so many years of my life, was finally completed. Seeing this photo was like revisiting the moment when I first came up with the design shape for that scratch plate, the one I called the pie, and I still remember the inexplicable flood of emotions I experienced at that time as I looked at what I'd just drawn. It was one of those rare moments in life when you know that something is just right, just perfect for the job. It's actually very difficult to put it properly into words. To most people, it's just a scratch plate. What's the big deal? To me, though, it was the icing on the cake, the ideal finishing touch. Of all the different shapes I could have used, this was the only perfect one for this guitar. And the way Tom had so expertly fitted it, so snugly around the 3 chrome pickups, it was like a work of art to me. It only remained now for Tom to make and fit the 2 cavity covers for the back and the truss rod cover for the headstock, so he suggested we could think about arranging a date and time for me to go and collect it. Both Robin and Dylan wanted to come with me when I went to collect it, So we agreed the best day to suit all of us would be Thursday, the 28th of April. So that's what I arranged with Tom. Robin was used to driving around Bristol, so he offered to drive Dylan and me there, rather than follow our original plan, which had been to take the bus. Bristol can be a bit tricky to drive through, and especially was at that time, as there were a lot of temporary one-way systems in place. Meanwhile, at the very last minute, Tom had changed his mind about the truss rod cover and made it out of black plastic instead of maple wood, which I agreed looked a lot better overall and tied in with everything else, as you can see here. Because he'd previously darkened the colour of the maple neck and headstock with that warming tint, using natural maple for the little cover would have made it look too pale and out of place against the richer colour behind it, whereas the black plastic tied in nicely with the scratch plate, the knobs, and these two new rear covers. Well, the big day arrived at last. Dylan, Robin and I travelled into Bristol, and here we were standing in front of Perrow's Bridge by the floating harbour. We went up to Tom's workshop, and there we saw my finished guitar for the very first time in the flesh. It wasn't actually lying on the bench like this. Tom had thoughtfully hung it up on the wall in full view of the door as we came in. It's just that I didn't have the presence of mind to take a photograph of it like that, so this is the last picture that Tom took himself of the guitar finally completed. Doesn't it look spectacular though? It's curvy, it's classy, and to me it's the epitome of the way a well-designed guitar should look, but then I'm bound to be biased, aren't I? Holding it in my hands, it felt substantial. Not too heavy, but not lightweight either. No matter what part of it you examined, the degree of finish was absolutely perfect in every respect. After I'd settled up with Tom and thanked him for his amazing work making my dream come true, I asked him if Robin and Dylan might have a quick look at his workshop while we were there, and he was happy to show us through. I wanted them to see, as I'd seen, the amazing skill and versatility of the man, borne witness to by all the half-finished guitars he had all round the room, in all shapes and styles, both electric and acoustic. They were, naturally, very impressed, and they both shook his hand when we took our leave, with me carrying my dream guitar in its hard case back to the car, from where we finally brought it home. So here it is. The actual guitar itself. What can I show you that you haven't already seen in this video? Here's the headstock with the Waghorn logo and my signature on it. The tuners are made by Schaller and a rear locking. Ebony fingerboard, 24 frets with a 0 fret. I've had a bolt-on neck, and Tom's made such a grand job of all these carved-out chamferings on the body to make it more comfortable to play. Behind here we've got the balance springs for the floating tremolo, and this one houses all the electronics for the knobs and switches. The 3 pickups are Burns Trisonic as used by Brian May, of course. And then finally, it's got this gorgeous, classy pickguard, which really sets off and balances up the whole design. I can't tell you how chuffed I am with this guitar. Tom's made such a superb job of it. But what, you might ask, does it sound like after all this? Well, I'll tell you what, let's get Dylan to play us out with a nice bit of improvisation, eh?